Welcome to the Savvy Dentist Podcast with Dr. Jesse Green, the show where great dentistry meets great business. Listen in each week as we bring you an inspiring person who will share their story, ideas and business techniques to help you create a practice and a life you love. And now introducing your host, Dr. Jesse Green.
Hello everyone, Jesse Green here. Welcome back to SavvyDentist.com and to the Savvy Dentist Podcast. It is wonderful to have your company today. And we're talking all about a really important subject, and that, of course, is how to have conversations. And it sounds like a simple thing, but it's not an easy thing. We all understand the value of being effective in our communications from a patient care point of view, but equally from a team perspective as well. We want to be able to affect outcomes. We want to be able to deliver great outcomes for patients, great outcomes for our team, great outcomes for our practice. And our ability to communicate effectively is a huge predictor of how successful we are in those spheres. Now, my guest today is Chris Fenning. Chris had his background as an IT guy. He's worked across multiple sectors around the globe, different countries here, there, and everywhere. What's really interesting about Chris, though, is he's an IT and technical guy that is a masterful communicator and is on a mission to help technical type of people, such as computer people and dentists and others, to become really good at their ability to communicate. I spoke to Chris about his book called The First Minute, and the subtitle of that book is How to Start Conversations That Get Results. And we covered a lot of territory. It's very practical. We spoke about how to frame a conversation. We spoke about the difference between frameworks and scripts and why you want to go for frameworks rather than scripts. We spoke about some of the common missteps and mistakes that people make in their communication and how to avoid them. It's a really practical episode, and I really encourage you to listen to this one many times over, because if you listen very carefully, there's lots of pearls of wisdom that Chris shares. And if you want to find out more about Chris and his book, head across to his website, chrisfenning.com, or if you want to get a copy of the book, The First Minute, you can get a copy of that at amazon.com.au or .com if you're in America or otherwise. But for now, let's get on to our conversation with Chris. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. Here he is. Chris Fenning, welcome to the Savvy Dentist Podcast. It is fantastic to have you here all the way from the Netherlands. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you very much, Jesse, for having me on the show.
Well, it's fantastic to talk to you, Chris, and I can see over your shoulder, and of course our listeners can't see this, I can see a wonderful image of your book called The First Minute, and I can't wait to dive in and talk to you about that. But before we jump on air, we're talking a little bit about your background, which is really fascinating and interesting. So before we get to the book and how to communicate effectively and to have the conversations we need to have, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your background, how you found your way into the world of communication, and really what prompted you to write the book.
Yes, you're absolutely right. My background isn't in communications training. I haven't been a corporate trainer for my career. My background was originally engineering, and I've always been in technical come business roles, leading projects, working in teams, leading big programs in all kinds of different industries. I mentioned I started out as an engineer, but I worked in defense and then telecoms and then the travel industry and then a sports equipment manufacturer and then web hosting and then healthcare. A very unusual career path. Perhaps in the modern day, that's a lot more common for people to shift around than it used to be. Through all of that, I was exposed to different communication styles around the world. Though most of my employers were global, and I've worked everywhere from Taiwan, Hong Kong, through the States, all through Europe. And that gave me a lot of exposure to how to do things well and how to not do things very well. And some of that experience was my own personal experience of not communicating particularly well. And that triggered my desire to know more about being a good communicator. More than just talking a lot or talking confidently, what does it really mean to be a good communicator? That was something that I just enjoyed. And the more I learned about it, the more I improved. And the more people asked me to then help them. My team asked for coaching, and then the team down the corridor asked for a bit of training, and then ended up doing company training. And that all led to the content of The First Minute as a book.
Fantastic. Well, it is a really rich and interesting background, and I can't wait to tap into it because, interestingly enough, engineers are perceived as being technically minded and of course, nuts and bolts, numbers, drawings, very precise in the work that they do. Dentists are very precise in the work that they do too. Your millimeter precision is, well, in fact, not even millimeter precision, it's fractions of millimeters that we're working with. And I suspect there's some similarities between engineers and dentists. And I think you mentioned earlier when we were off air that you wanted to change the perception that technical sorts can't communicate well. And I think that's a really wonderful mission. One of the things I've noticed about dentists, and certainly in recent years, is we focus so much of our training on those technical skills. But from a dental point of view, there's a person on the end of the teeth that we're working with. And we've got to remember that person comes with emotions, that person comes with feelings and thoughts and fears and all the stuff.
Fears,
all the stuff that makes us human. So I wanted to ask a question, and this was actually not what I was planning, but you gave me a beautiful segue that I'd like to just pick up and run with before we get to the book is, what do you see, if anything, as the difference between being a communicator versus a conversationalist?
What a good question. The work conversations versus social conversations are different because work conversations are transactional. And it's something that isn't taught or talked about very often. Through our entire lives, we learn two major types of communication. We learn social interaction because that's what we're surrounded by with family and friends and society. And we learn to be on receive and ask mode in the education system, which is a lot more just sit and get information and then do work by yourself and occasionally in teams. When we get into work, there's a very different type of communication. It's transactional. Because while socially our goal is to inform or entertain, at work, if you spend your whole time entertaining, you're not doing the job. We're paid to do a job, to achieve tasks, overcome problems, find solutions. And all of that is transactional. I'm either giving you information because I need help, or you need help, or you need this thing, or we have to achieve something. And that's the biggest difference between being a good, or one of the core differences between being a good communicator at work and being a good conversationalist. Because if you deliver everything at work like a conversationalist, people might enjoy the pleasure of your company, but you won't be as effective in delivering the information for those transactional needs.
So the outcomes are likely to suffer, presumably, as a result of that, I imagine, too, not getting that
Yes,
across.
The outcomes can suffer. Your relationships with people can suffer. Because while they might love having a chat with you, they might not want to work with you because you never get anything done. You never get to the point. And that's the difference. It's like, Jesse, you're such a good guy to be around, but I don't want you on my team because all you'll do is talk.
Yeah, totally. Love it. Thank you for that. I think it's a really good place to start, and it's a really nice place to anchor our conversation because you have spent many hours writing your book, which means you spent probably an exponential number of hours thinking about the book and what you want to write and communicating and how you're going to take what's in your mind and put it onto a page. There's typically a reason why people write a book. You don't normally sit down on a Sunday afternoon and say, hey, today I'm going to write a book. There's usually a drive or something that you want to say or something that's bugged you or whatever it is. There's a motivation. And I'm wanting to ask you about your motivation for writing the book because I know how much effort goes into writing a book, and to stick with it and get it done, there's an urgency and importance and something that's on your mind. So I'm wondering, what was your drive, please, Chris?
Yes, I had a drive and an inspiration and an opportunity, a drive, an inspiration, and an opportunity. The drive was actually not to write this book. This is the book that I had to write to be able to write the book that I really want to write.
Okay.
Might sound a bit odd, but you mentioned my goal to remove the stereotype, destroy that stereotype that techies can't communicate. And so the book that I'm currently writing and I really am passionate about beyond all else is helping IT and technical people speak the business language. But every time I started conversations or started training or started writing about that, the very first thing that I always came back to was, doesn't matter if you can speak the business language. If you can't be clear and concise, it's irrelevant. Clear and concise is the fundamental foundation of good communication at work. And so I had to write this book because I would only ever be talking about this before I talked about the thing that is like the really burning passion. I love this stuff, but it's step one of being a good communicator. So that was my objective. And then I ended up writing this. And I'm so glad I did because it pulled together years worth of ideas and concepts from other people, my own experiences, and pulled it all together into one quite succinct package, which was very helpful.
So it's very helpful given it's about being concise.
Yeah, yes, that was always in my mind. I dreaded the word count going up. I was thinking, if this book is long and it's about being concise, the irony wouldn't be lost on me, but it wouldn't achieve the purpose. So being a short book was also a goal. When you write any book, the book is as long as the material needs to be.
Of course it is, yeah.
In this case, I got lucky that it's a short book on a short topic.
Well, there's also that wonderful saying that I think it's Mark Twain, and I might be misattributing this to Mark Twain, but someone's famous for saying, I would have written a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time. To be concise is actually quite an art form, and to be deliberate with your language and concise and succinct with your language, it does require skill and practice to be able to do that. So I really like what you've spoken about there.
It does. You're absolutely right. And that quote comes up with so many different names attached to it. Whoever said it, it's definitely true.
Yeah.
I mentioned that this is what I was trying to write. My inspiration was my best friend at the time. I said best friend at the time. That makes it sound like he's not. It was at the time of writing this, my best friend said, he gave me the push to say, you should do more than just teach the team down the corridor. You should do this as your job. And I was in a very secure corporate role in a senior position. And the idea of just leaping out of that and going into being an author and a trainer and an instructor was terrifying. He was somebody who was outside of my head and gave me a different perspective that I could do this. And that with that and the opportunity of my wife saying, yep, I agree, and that she would support us as I made this transition from employed to self-employed, meant that I had both the desire, had the inspiration, and the opportunity to take this step. And I sat down and I wrote the book. It was about 7 or 8 months from starting writing to being on the shelf.
Wow, that's pretty good. That's really good. That's really focusing and getting it all done. So I really like that. And I love the fact that your best friend gave you that good friendly advice that good friends do and say, hey, you need to do this, which is wonderful. So I wanted to just start getting into the meat and potatoes of our conversation. And I guess I wanted to ask perhaps a very broad question to begin with, and that is the tagline for your book is really all about making sure that the conversation gets results. The title is The First Minute, How to Start Conversations That Get Results. And I wanted to ask you, why is it that some conversations don't get results? Where do we go wrong? What's the issue?
The issues,
plural, yes.
There are a few of them, and we're all guilty of them, and it's nobody's fault. So I'm going to start by, I'm going to list a bunch of problems. We'll do them at some point, and these are just a fact of life at the moment. Mm-hmm. So they go wrong because we as people, our brains think at something like 800 words a minute, and our mouths work at 200 words a minute. Mm-hmm. So there's 4 times as much going on in our head as there is coming out of our mouth. And quite often our heads might run ahead in the conversation, or our mouth only brings out a couple of disjointed thoughts from our minds. At a core level, we're operating at 2 different speeds while trying to communicate. So that's going to cause us problems. Now, the type of problems are we mix up multiple topics in the same conversation. Mm-hmm. We start a conversation and we don't tell the other person what the topic is because we know it. It's in our head. And we were probably, before we started the conversation, running through it in our minds. And we start the conversation wherever we got up to in our heads rather than starting at the beginning for the audience. So there are a couple of examples. This is a really important one that causes very real problems at work. We don't make our intentions clear when we start communicating. And you'll have experienced this if you've ever been in a conversation, you've either said or thought, wait, what? Why are you telling me this? You're 5 minutes into a conversation and you still don't know why the other person is giving you information. It's because you don't know what they intend you to do with it. And that is a very real problem because every piece of information you get needs to be processed and understood and cataloged with the understanding of you're meant to do something with it. So if someone's been talking for 5 minutes and you don't know whether you're meant to be answering a question or taking an action or just enjoying the story, when they get to the end and say, so can you help? you've not been able to process the previous 5 minutes of information because you didn't know that they were asking you for help. You're just spending the whole time going, what am I meant to do with this?
Yeah. Love that. This is one of the things that I notice with communication and being able to have effective dialogue with people that is transactional, that gets an outcome as compared to social conversation, is the power of pre-framing. And I wanted to ask you your thoughts on the validity of that as a method. And from your perspective, I know there's 101 ways you can do things, and I'm curious to understand how you might do that if you think it's useful, so that people do focus their attention at the beginning of that conversation and they're not kind of wondering what is happening further down the track. So could you just have a bit of a talk about that for a second?
Absolutely. You've just raised the topic that is the first third of the book.
Okay.
And it's literally called framing.
Yeah.
So starting conversations by framing them is important for all the reasons you just mentioned. You need to get the attention and the focus and understanding of your audience. When someone starts talking to us, we need to know a few things. We need to know the general topic. And an example of this is if I started talking to you and I said, hey, Jesse, I want to talk to you about next Friday. And in my head, I'm thinking about a meeting. And in your head, you're thinking about the dinner that we're going to have.
Yeah.
So I say, I want to talk to you about next Friday. I think we should invite Jeff and Santosh and Amy. And in your head, you're going, but Amy's in a different country. How's she going to come to dinner? And I'm thinking about a meeting.
Yes.
We're already having two different conversations.
Totally.
So the very first thing in a conversation, when we frame a conversation, needs to be the context. What is the topic? The second thing is the intent. We just talked about this. What do I intend for you to do with this information? Because I'm going to take your time. Whether it's 30 seconds, it's rarely 30 seconds, but whether it's 30 seconds or 30 minutes, I'm taking your time. And so I need to let you know what the outcome of that time is and what I intend for you to do. And the psychology of this is if we don't know what we're meant to do with something, we can't process the information properly. So having provided context, which is the first part of framing, we then need to provide our intent. I need your help. This is a funny story. I need a decision. Can you approve this? Very short statements that let people know what they're being asked to do. And then the third part of framing is just like any news article, start it with a headline or a key message.
Yeah.
Hey, Jesse, I want to talk to you about next Friday's dinner. I'm having trouble getting a reservation. Can you help me? I'm having trouble getting a reservation at the restaurant. There's a whole conversation after that, but you now know what the conversation is about. You know that I'm asking you for help, and you know what the key problem is that I'm going to be facing. So that's framing a conversation. It takes 10 to 15 seconds. And if you do it, here are the benefits. I realize I'm running on a little bit here. Sorry.
No, run on, because I love this, because you're speaking my love language when we talk about framing.
Great. Well, here are the benefits. When you provide context, you focus the other person's mind. You're sitting next to someone at work, you're working on the same project, you turn to them to talk about the project that you're talking about or that you're working on. And you say, hey, so about that thing, their mind might have been on lunch, a different piece of work, a family event, medical stuff. It's going to be on anything else other than the topic that you want to talk about. So their mind is focused on something else, something that's important to them at the time. So that by providing context, you help shove out all those other topics, most or many of those other topics from that person's head, and at least bring them closer to knowing the topic you want to talk about. So you're getting their focus. By making the intent clear, by saying, I need your help, or this is heads up, this is info you need to know before the client meeting, that tells them why it's valuable to them. When we know the value to us, we pay attention.
Yeah.
Unless it's totally not valuable, but then we have an opportunity to say, I don't have time to talk about this, and we can leave the conversation.
And do you think that if you're wanting to have a conversation, one of the things I've always felt that was useful around framing the conversation is, maybe not useful, but one of the thoughts I've had about framing, it can be useful, is that whoever sets the frame really does set the context. They set the boundaries for that conversation.
Yes.
It really does mean that you're getting to speak about the things you want to speak about. And I've always, when I've been talking to the clients I work with, is if you want to control that conversation, you want to be able to be the person who sets the frame for it. If you want to have the conversation you want to have, you've got to be the one setting the frame. And whoever sets the frame gets to kind of set the agenda pretty much.
Yes. Yes. Because you're providing the guidelines for what the conversation is and isn't about.
Yeah.
And some people react a little defensively to the word control.
Yeah,
So
I was trying to choose my words a little bit better. Just my vocabulary failed me at the critical moment.
It's a good word. I'm glad you used it, because controlling a conversation, many people will initially think you're trying to be manipulative or gain a certain outcome. And the thing is you're not being manipulative, but you are trying to get a certain outcome when you're at work. Again, work is transactional. It's different from the social. If you're trying to control every social conversation, you're not going to be necessarily a fun person to communicate with all the time.
And you'll have fewer social conversations as a consequence.
You will have fewer social conversations from it, yes. But at work, our jobs are about achieving goals, overcoming problems, and putting in place solutions. So when I have a conversation with you, Dr. Jesse, I need to solve this problem. I need to control the conversation so that I get to the resolution of my problem. And we don't go off on 17 different directions to talk about other connected or loosely affiliated things. So controlling the conversation, it's a good way to think about it. And you're trying to control it to get the outcome that you want. Now, the key distinction is you're not trying to control all the words and the entire direction. You're trying to control getting the outcome that you want. And framing gives you a framework to do that. So if the conversation goes off on a different direction, you get to say, oh, hang on, this is interesting, but let's come back to what we were originally trying to achieve. And the framework helps you mentally know whether you're staying on track or not.
Yeah, thank you. And again, such a great communicator, because you've given me a lovely little segue to pick up again. It's like a ball of wool. I can take any part of it and pull it, and we're going to have some really rich veins of conversation that come out of this. And I want to pick up on the word framework, because in a lot of the work that we do with dental practices, one of the things that people typically ask for is, can you help me train my front desk person, my reception team, or whatever language we put to that, around how to do this or how to communicate with the patient this way or this scenario, and so on and so forth. And invariably, most traditional training has involved scripts, and it's a game of verbal ping pong. Chris says this, Jesse says that, Chris responds with this, and of course it goes swimmingly well until A, Jesse throws a curveball and Chris goes, hang on, that's not on the script, Jesse. Or B, we're asking someone to use words that don't feel natural and comfortable for them, and so that feels weird and contrived. And we spoke a little bit about frameworks and the structure that a framework can give you as to help you guide you through that conversation to get an outcome without feeling like you've got to use a particular word or words or someone else's language. Could you just speak to the importance of that structure, please, overall?
Yes, you've already described it so well, because the framework gives you something you can use to get to the place that you want, to get the right outcome from the conversation, but you're not forcing words into people's mouths, and you're not in that situation that you described, which is, oh, hang on, what you said isn't on my script, so shut down, I don't know what to say next. As people, we struggle with being scripted. Actors do really well in learning specific scripts, because our natural inclination is to just ad lib or say the things that come into our heads or say what feels better. An example of this is if you've ever seen sort of interviews or the director's cuts of movies where they do commentary, there'll be scenes where the actors are reading the script but can't say the words on the page because they don't feel right to them in the moment or in that scene. And that's an example of our humanity overcoming the script on the page. So in those situations, they talk about what's the goal of the scene? Why do I have to use these specific words? Or can I try and get a point across, a meaning across, a feeling across? And the similar thing is with the people in your organizations, front desk staff, or whoever's interacting with the customers. If they know the goal of the interaction, which is to make sure that Mrs. Jefferson rebooks her appointment every month so that she can come in and get the level of care that she needs. That's the goal. And then the framework gives the waypoints to reach. So in the conversation, you need to at least get her to acknowledge that she needs to come back and talk about availability. And maybe you talk about, are there any transport needs getting to dental surgery? There can be different components of the conversation. And then you allow the human that's having it the free rein to have it in a way that works for them and works for the person they're talking to, because there's always more than one person in that communication. So the framework is important. It helps keep them on track, but it's very different from keeping them specifically on script.
Love that. And you've used another word as well, which is intention. And one of the things that my lovely wife, who I adore, and she says to me, Jesse, sometimes I feel like you choose your words all the time. And I said, well, I probably do choose my words. I like to think I'm conscious of the words I speak. And that's sometimes good, sometimes not. But I wanted to, I guess, my comment, my observation is that sometimes I notice some people are a little casual with their words, and it can create an effect that's unintended. And so what I find with work communication is having some intention behind the framework that we use, but equally when we do use our own language within that framework, still being intentional around that.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Could you pick that up and just give me your thoughts on that?
I can. And I'm laughing because I made a terrible mistake with casual word choices. And
I'll put two hands up being guilty for that too.
If any of my previous colleagues listen to this, there will be some nodding. When I moved from individual contributor to a manager a few years ago, I was working in a project environment with very high intensity programs, short timeframes, huge expectations of success on these programs. And there wasn't enough time in the day to talk about everything. Not every problem could get in the limelight all the time. And to help people move through the topics or filter out what we should talk about, I very carelessly said, I don't care about that.
Mm.
And I would repeat that often. We don't need to care about that. I don't care about that. We don't care about that. What I meant was, that's not as important as this other thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's a small but enormous difference. Small in terms of the words, enormous in how people felt and reacted to my careless word choice. I don't care about that. Some people felt, I don't care about you, because for them, the problem was important. So rather than explaining why something else might have needed to be a priority, or even better than that, taking just a moment to shut up and listen to why they were talking about it and why it was important to them and what the implications were. There's a whole bunch of leadership stuff that I failed at in a big way in those moments. But picking the wrong word for care rather than, I don't care about that as much as this, it should have been, this is not as important as that for these reasons.
Yeah.
And so word choice was
yeah. If I was to pull back the curtain, I could show you a trail of devastation around conversations that I've mishandled and things that have gone wrong. And even now, as I think about some of those conversations, I feel that sense of embarrassment, or I feel that sense of shame, almost not quite shame, but oh my God, I can't believe I did that facepalm moment sort of thing. And so I think we're all guilty of that. And I wanted to ask, how do we become more intentional then? If we want to be more intentional, is it a case of just being mindful of what's running through our mind? Is it a practice? How do we become intentional without becoming so bogged down in thinking everything through that we lose all spontaneity?
Yes. This is a topic that I'm still learning. And it's a lifelong learning for learning about empathy and communicating as a leader rather than as a dictator. There are lots of components to picking the right words in the right moments.
Yeah.
And the methods that help me, some of which are in the first minute and some of which I'm just learning through other channels, are, again, coming back to the frameworks to keep the conversation on track to specific goals.
Yeah.
And when you use the frameworks, it helps keep some of the emotions out. I'll give an example. So if one of the challenging things that we have at work all the time is delivering bad news. And not the bad news that you're going to be let go. That's a very specific type of conversation, but bad news that we're going to miss a deadline, we failed to do something, something's broken, there's a problem. And our human sides want to defend ourselves. So if I go to my boss and I say, hey, there's this problem, inside I'm going, well, it wasn't me, or here's what I did about it to avoid it. And I try and downplay the level of the problem and go into self-defense mode of explaining, I've tried all these things to fix it. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on emotionally when we talk about problems or issues. And one of the frameworks that I've used to help keep that emotion out is being able to summarize something, focusing just on the facts of the situation. Mm-hmm. And you can do that if you use a goal, problem, solution summary. It's a 3-part summary. And so if I was coming to you to talk about a problem Let's say I'd failed to deliver a project that you'd asked me to work on. The goal was I was trying to deliver this piece of work that you've asked for. The problem is 3 suppliers have gone out of business and I can't get the parts that we need. But here's what I'm doing about it. Here's the solution. I found another supplier. I'm talking with Sue from another team to get some extra resources, and we're trying to get things back on track. So it's very factual. And it also ties into the things that you need to know. You need to know what's the goal, and then what's the issue that I'm having. So we're trying to achieve this thing. And then here's the reason why we can't achieve it. And that's where most conversations stop or get bogged down in the, well, here's why the problem occurred, and here's the chronological timeline of all the events that happened, and but it was that team over there that didn't do it, and here's what I'm tried to do to avoid it. Even now, I'm running into a long description of the problem, which is how we think and communicate. Don't do that. Just state there is this problem. And then move on to, here's what I'm going to do about it. Here's what we're doing about it. Or I need your help because I need to do something about it. Move that conversation onto the future-looking, action-based, how you're going to solve the problem. And if you do that, if you start your challenging conversations with getting to the solution, you get to jump over the long, difficult descriptions of the problem, which is where we tend to get most of our emotional words come out and the excuses. And I say excuses, I don't mean that in a negative way, just the reasons why things have happened. And if you can skip past that, then your word choice is much easier because you're just describing the fact of the situation. I want to deliver this piece of software. We want to install the new 3D printer for creating crowns. The problem is, can't get any of the materials. Here's what I'm going to do about it.
Lovely. So many pearls of wisdom there. Ladies and gents, if you've just tuned in, I'm having a conversation with Chris Fenning, and we're talking all about communication skills. And Chris is a masterful communicator, and I really enjoy talking to him about this. And if you've not yet got a copy of his book called The First Minute, please go ahead and grab yourself a copy. You can get a copy of that at his website, chrisfenning.com, probably on Amazon as well, Chris, I imagine.
Anywhere you buy books.
Anywhere you buy books. So do yourself a favor, as Molly Meldrum would say here in Australia, get a copy of the book. But Chris, I wanted to ask you a little bit about why we don't just get born with this factory installed. Why do we have to learn communication? Why is this something that's not kind of part of our DNA? Help me understand that, because when I speak to people about communication, I say, why do I have to learn this? Why can't I just speak, and won't my message be received, and all those other sorts of things? So what's the difference between this and getting the factory installation?
Oh, okay. So if I gave you 3 balls, could you juggle for me?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Well, why not?
Well, exactly. I've never learned to do it. Exactly. There's your answer
right there.
We haven't learned
to do it. Everything in our lives, this comes back to the social versus transactional for work. Everything in our lives is learned. Everything that's not biological, being able to breathe and process proteins and things like that. Walking, we have to learn to walk. If you were strapped to the ground for the first 10 years of your life, you wouldn't suddenly get up and walk. You have to learn it. There's muscle memory. There's teaching your body to move in certain ways, teaching your brain to process all the different minutiae, moving forwards and catching yourself with every step. Everything we do is learned. And communication is learned and taught socially. We're surrounded by people who talk in our families and at school and in our social circles. So we're taught social communication partly by osmosis, by observing, and by practicing it every day. If when I'm at school, if I go up to the big kid in the playground and say, "You smell, wear deodorant," I'm probably not going to have a great result from that. So I learn pretty quickly the social niceties, the ways to interact safely. Communicating at work is different, and we're never taught how to do it. And it's a bold claim, but we're not. 14 years of education, whether you go in at 5 and come out at 18 or 19, then have university education after that. How many classes do you have on how to communicate at work?
Well, none. And this is exactly the point, is that it is a skill like any other skill, any other thing that we learn, we can learn this too. I think that really does talk to the point of speaking words and actually communicating effectively. There's a big difference around just word stream versus being able to communicate. Do you think there's any cultural overlays to this at all? Where does cultural overlay fit into this?
Yes, there's definitely cultural overlay, and not just cultures between different countries, but in our own country,
Totally,
within our own social experience. So having worked globally, I know that the way people communicate and the content of what they communicate and the meaning in Asia and in some Asian countries are very different from America, which is different again from Spain, which is different from sub-Saharan Africa, because culturally we learn to speak to authority and power in different ways. And for those of us in English-speaking Western countries, the best way to understand this, it's conceptual. It's difficult to get your head around as to, you might know it, but really understanding it is different. Think about how you would talk to your best mate if you met them down the pub or at a barbecue or a footy match.
Yep.
And then think about how you'd talk to your gran. Do you do it in the same way? No. I mean, some people do, maybe because their friends are a lot like their gran or their grans are super cool.
Yeah, well, they might have a super cool gran, but yeah, no, it's usually two different types of communication. Yeah.
And if you went to court, would you address the judge in the same way that you address your best mate?
No.
We adapt our communication to different situations. And a lot of the situations we experience in life, we get exposure to through film, TV, and those sorts of things. So we know that when you go to court, not only your own feelings make you sort of a little smaller and a little more reluctant to be a big outgoing communicator, but you've also seen how it's done. And each country and each culture has different expectations. I work with a lot of Indian companies, and one of the challenges that they face is talking about problems to people higher up, because the goal is to say, yes, we can get it done.
Yes.
And that's part of it, just a fantastic culture of solving the problems and getting things done. But there's also an ingrained difference in the way they communicate about certain topics compared to how people in Italy might or people in Kenya might. There's definitely a cultural element to it. And to understand it, think about how you communicate differently with different generations.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about. The different generations is next, because it's the same sort of thing again, isn't it? There's the different styles of communication across different age groups. I've got teenage daughters, and I'm very familiar with the different styles of communication at the present time. I can assure you, Chris, that I'm learning a lot. So that's really interesting. Chris, you've been a really generous guest today, and I really feel like I could talk to you for hours and hours on end. But before we wrap up, I want to let our audience know that you have very generously put together a promotion. And the promotion is, as I understand it, if people want to grab a copy of your book, which of course is called The First Minute, if they grab a copy of that book, if they leave a review on Amazon and contact you and let you know about that, you're very generously going to be doing some free training for them on this material. Is that, as I understand it?
That's right. Yep. If you leave an Amazon review and get in touch with me, I'll come and do a 1-hour training for your team, your department, your organization, if you want to put it together. But that's what you'll get. 1 review equals 1 hour of training.
Wow, there we go. Now, so what I want to ask you is, what's the best way for people to reach out to you after they've done the review? Okay,
they can either connect with me on LinkedIn and message me that way, send a message through the contact form on the website, or email me directly at chris@chrisfenning.com.
Fantastic. So, Chris, that's a really, really generous offer, and thank you for putting that together. I really appreciate that. It's a wonderful read, your book, and it's a really important topic. And I know this is the first of a series. It's going to be a bit like the Star Wars series. This is the prequel, and then we're going to get to the main event and then have the sequel later. But I wanted to ask you, if we could have the gospel according to Chris, if there was a couple of golden rules according to you around what makes great communication, what would be just 1 or 2 pearls of wisdom that you'd leave the audience with today?
Okay. So the first one is get the first minute right.
Yep.
And what I mean by that is start at the beginning of your work topic, lay out the context, make your intentions clear, give them a summary of your topic before you go into it. If you do that, you avoid so many of the problems we've talked about today.
Yeah.
And it's one thing. If you can focus on 1 minute, you'll have better conversations. The second, use language that your audience relates to and understands. And this is true whether you are a software developer or whether you are a dentist, whether you're in medicine, whether you're in the janitorial service. Use language your audience understands. You might know what a specific word or a phrase means, but describe things in ways that mean something to them.
Fantastic. Chris, that is pearl after pearl after pearl of wisdom in terms of communication. Of course, as I said at the beginning, as dentists, we deal with teeth, but on the end of those teeth are complex beings called humans. And these conversations that we need to be able to have, not just with our patients, but with our team members and anyone else with whom we interact, are really, really important. And I think if we can have quality conversations, it goes a long way to having a quality life. And so I want to thank you, firstly, for joining us on the podcast today. And secondly, and very importantly, for taking the time and putting the effort into writing the book, because, as I said, I know how much work goes into that. So big kudos to you, my friend. So once again, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
You're a good man. We'll talk soon.
Thank you for listening to the Savvy Dentist podcast with Dr. Jesse Green. For more free tools and resources, join the free Facebook group. Visit drjessegreen.com/Facebook. And for more episodes, visit drjessegreen.com/savvydentist.